Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Paul. I'm from the Association of MBAs. With us, we have John Lees, who will be the presenter of this webinar today. John, he is a career transition coach and a successful author of having published 13 books. Today's subject will be on how not to sleepwalk your way into your next role. I'm speaking to John, and it's a great subject. I'm sure everyone's going to enjoy this. I'm really looking forward to it myself. So I'm going to pass over to John, where he's going to do the presentation, and we hope everyone enjoys it.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is John Lees. I'm the author of a wide range of careers books. The subject I'm going to talk to you about today really relates to my latest book, which is the 10th edition of How to Get a Job You Love. I'm going to talk to you about sleepwalking. The title of this presentation is How Not to Sleepwalk Your Way into Your Next Role. What I mean by sleepwalking is this, that we have a kind of a default mode in our careers. Now, every electronic device in the world has a default mode, and you can reset it. Now, human beings have a default mode when they sleepwalk their way into jobs. Let me explain what I mean by that. What I mean is that things get thrown at us. We don't think very hard about the kind of change we'd like to make, and we get offered roles, or people expect us to go into the roles that are predicted by some of the information that's on the screen in front of you. So based on the most recent job, or your work history, or your opening statement, the first 15 words on your CV are always an interesting kind of pigeonholing factor. And finally, of course, what people say about you, how people recommend you. So what I'd like to do today is to encourage people to be a little bit more focused, a little bit more active, and a bit more effective in terms of making a career change. So this webinar, I hope, will help you if you're currently looking for a role, or if you think you might be looking for a role sometime in the next few months. Because we are fairly good at being passive. Why are we passive? Well, because when people want to change careers, when they're going to the marketplace, talking about themselves, they're naturally vulnerable. Being vulnerable, we tend to be slightly less outgoing, slightly less dynamic. We tend to rely more on luck and chance and other people. We would ideally, I think, like to be moved around like a parcel. So we'd love it when people tap us on the shoulder, or jobs are put in front of us. We love the idea of handing over our career to other people. So we do things like rely very heavily on recruitment agencies without having a very clear message about how they can help us. And we spend an awful lot of time on job boards, which is very passive, even though it looks like work. It's passive because essentially you're relying on a kind of a lottery system, really, to break through to employers. So let's think about the effect of those passive behaviours in terms of the way every generation is looking for a job right now. And we see this amongst graduates, we see it amongst business school graduates, we see it amongst people changing careers in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. The first passive behaviour is that they tend to apply for candidate magnets. Now, the first kind of candidate magnets are advertised positions. If you see an interesting job advertised in any medium, then it is going to attract a lot of applications. And I don't know how you feel about long odds, but if you're up against 400 or 500 other people for a role, it's very, very difficult, even if you have a brilliant CV, to break through into a final shortlist. The second passive behavior is that people aim very high and then they aim low. Now, let me explain that here. What I mean by aiming high is that they go for attractive, visible, well-known, highly branded, popular organizations. You know the kind of ones I'm talking about. Well-known public, organizations that are well-known in public. And they apply for interesting jobs in those organizations. And of course, they are up against large numbers of other competitors. And what happens is they don't get offered an interview and they don't get any feedback. So if that's what 100% looks like, if that's the top end of their range, you'd expect them to perhaps just think, well, come down a couple of notches. And instead of going for a job which is 100%, I'll go for 98%, but they don't. What happens is they aim high a couple of times, they receive zero feedback, because that's the way the market operates at the moment. We don't get feedback about how our job applications are doing, on how they've done, and then they go for something lower. So that's why we get really quite bright people applying for jobs that are well below their status and ability level. And the third passive behavior I want to talk to you about today is about the way we think about our CVs. People come up to me at events and they say, well, I've met a great contact. What I'm going to do tomorrow morning is I'm going to send a CV to start a conversation. And I will usually say, well, you really want to close the door that quickly, do you? Because a CV is a very poor door opener. It's great if somebody's met you, or they know something about you, or they've heard about you, because it confirms what they're already thinking. But if you send a CV to somebody cold, that's what I would call a big ask. It takes at least 15 minutes to reply sensibly to a request to look at a CV, even if you're just saying, yes, I noticed this, or this looks useful, or here's something which you might find helpful. It takes that amount of time. Most people do not have that time in their diaries. So if you're sending somebody a CV by email, particularly if it's a cold contact, it's likely to be deleted almost immediately. If you ask them 2 or 3 questions only, or simply ask them one question, they'll probably deal with it, because everybody likes to clear their inbox of tasks that they can get hold of. Now, I want to focus on one other particular issue, really, around what happens for people that want to make a career change. So let's call this jumping the fence, jumping from one kind of career to another. People talk about having lots of different careers, and I don't really believe in that. I think we have one career, and how we describe that career, how it comes together as a story, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But there are distinct difficulties if you want to change sector, if you want to move into a different kind of organization. Your skills don't translate, but there are things you can do about that. The story may not make sense, but again, there's ways of dealing with that. And the last thing, however, is evidence of commitment. Because do remember that a lot of people go into the marketplace and they're really exploring. So when they say, I'm thinking of making a career change, what a recruiter hears is, I'm toying with this idea, but I will probably do something conventional. In other words, probably stay in default mode. Now, evidence of commitment could be that you've taken a job in a new sector, or you've taken an interim appointment, but it could also be that you've spent a lot of time actually visiting and talking to people in your new target sector. Shoe leather is a really good piece of evidence. So rather than say, I'm thinking about this, talk about who you've met and have the kind of conversations that you've had with people and what you've learned and what you've found exciting. So during today's webinar, we're going to ask you a couple of questions, very easy to deal with, and we're going to run a little poll now. And the poll question I'd like you to think about is this: what is the biggest barrier to finding an interesting new job? What's the biggest barrier for you? So the poll is now open. These are the 5 options I'd like you to think about. What's the biggest barrier? Is it finding people to connect with? Is it identifying new organizations? Is it something as simple as finding job openings, finding vacancies? Is it knowing how to showcase your work history? Or is the biggest barrier knowing how to talk about your skills, how to explain your skill set? So have a think about that. Choose one of those options. And I think we just about had enough time for most people to respond to that. We've got a good number of people on the webinar today, so it'll be very interesting to see the results. So I'm hoping that Paul might be able to give us some numbers now.
So 31% said knowing how to explain my skill set. 24% said finding people to connect with. 19% said knowing how to showcase my work history. 14% said finding job openings, and 12% said identifying organizations.
Well, that's fascinating, because that would seem to suggest that although identifying organizations and vacancies is important, the two biggest elements are the things that we're talking about today: finding people to connect with, and we'll come to that later on, and also knowing how to explain your skills. And I would like to talk to you in a few moments about how we communicate skills from one sector to another. I think that my job as a career coach is to shorten people's job search time. And that's one of my most important benchmarks. And the reason is that at the beginning of a job search, people have energy, they have commitment, they sound excited, they sound positive. If that job search goes on too long, we have to do a great deal of work to keep people sounding energized. And because time matters, I'm interested in helping people to avoid what I would call rookie mistakes. You might think these are made just by school or university leavers, but they're not. They're made by people that go to the marketplace in every generation. And of course, one of the reasons that this happens is that some people are in jobs for a very long time. So it's quite common that people say to me, well, I've been inside this organization for 20 years. I've never had to apply for a job. I've always been bumped up from one role to another. And now I'm going to be looking for a job and I really don't know how the market operates. And that's perfectly reasonable. Looking for a job is a technical skill set, which requires quite a high degree of self-awareness, and it requires an understanding of how things move forward and what you look like when you present certain kinds of messages. So here are some of the rookie mistakes I see every month. The first thing is applying for random jobs in a random way. So if you think you're applying for an awful lot of jobs and not getting many offers of interview, if you're not getting shortlists, just be careful with your own statistics. So if you say, oh, look, I've applied for 100 jobs, I've only got one interview, that's 1 in 100, that's not very good. You're probably using junk statistics. And the reason I say that is that you shouldn't be counting random targets. You shouldn't be counting wild shots. You should only be looking at the things that are at the center of your dartboard. In other words, jobs which make sense in terms of your CV, where you will be a credible candidate, where you have a reasonably good chance of being shortlisted. You might think it's sensible to play the numbers game, but be careful about that, because applying for a whole range of jobs that don't seem to make any sense actually affects your market reputation, particularly where recruitment consultants are involved. So one of the things I can recommend to you is get focused. Decide what kinds of roles that you're looking at. Maybe pin it down to 5 or 6 different kinds of organizations and focus on the center of the target. Rather than asking for a bigger dartboard, learn how to aim a little bit more carefully. The second rookie mistake made by every generation is that when they go to the marketplace, they go to it with a message which is vague or flat or just doesn't work. And the reason people do that is a kind of a defense mechanism. They think, well, I don't want to be too specific. I don't want to rule out options. Well, again, that makes you sound like a generalist. And ultimately, if your message is, I can do anything, I'm flexible, I've got great potential, then be careful, because that's the message that brand new, inexperienced graduates are offering the marketplace. And if you want to sound like an inexperienced 20-year-old, then that's fine. But you've probably got a lot more experience and knowledge and focus and competence and expertise to offer. So don't be vague, be specific, and don't be flat, be energized. Third line then, thinking about context. We all have good names in our little black books. We all have people that we can go to, and that's great, but don't go to them too soon, because if you get in front of these decision makers and your message essentially is, I don't really know what I'm looking for yet, and I'm feeling a little bit lacking in confidence in terms of the way I present myself, then that's something they're not going to be able to help you with. You'll get a bit of sympathy, perhaps, you'll get some positive noises, but you're going to get much, much better results if you go to a decision maker slightly later in the process when you can say, can you help me to do this? Can you introduce me to this person? Do you have a contact in this named organization? I want to do this one specific thing. What advice can you give me? Because those people will probably help, and they'll probably give you fantastic help. And secondly, you're going to be planting a message with them that gives them your shopping list, gives them your focused message. And the last but by no means least here on this list, using email the right way, because we hide behind screens. Back in the 1980s, everyone assumed that when times were hard then, that nobody would be at home, that everybody would be out and about. But the problem was that in those days, everybody had a landline phone. As soon as mobile phones were introduced, everyone said, well, great, job seekers are not going to be stuck at home waiting for a phone call. They're going to be out and about. But they are still at home because they're stuck behind their screens. And using email actually maintains distance. Now think about it this way. How long do you remember an email? You may only remember an email for 30 seconds if it's irrelevant or asking you to do something difficult. Even if it's from somebody you know well and you're going to respond to it, you'll probably only remember it a couple of hours. A phone call you remember for maybe half a day. A warm face-to-face meeting where you help somebody or somebody helps you, particularly where one of you sends a thank you card afterwards. Well, let me tell you, you can remember that meeting for about 12 months. If you send somebody a thank you card, a real thank you card, not an email, they will probably keep it under the glass of their desk or stick it on a notice board, and they will remember that conversation for as long as that card remains in the room with them. So you do the mathematics on this. How long do you want to be remembered? Just a couple of minutes or 12 months? It's a huge difference here. Face-to-face is the answer, because face-to-face gives you a lot more information. So you'll be pleased to hear I've got some advice here about shortening your job search. Use social media to create meetings. So break the rules of LinkedIn in a gentle way. What I mean by that is LinkedIn wants everybody to connect electronically. So you can do that to start with. Use LinkedIn to spot people that are interesting to you, that people that you know who are in organizations that you want to know more about, maybe even tapping into alumni networks. And then as soon as you find somebody interesting, try to pick up the phone. And after you've picked up the phone, try to go and see them face to face. Obviously, you can only do that if they're within reasonable travel distance, but it's worth it. If you've got to travel down to a city, get 2 or 3 appointments in your diary, you will discover at least 1,000% more in terms of decoding jobs, in terms of decoding organizations, in terms of being remembered face-to-face than you will by any other method. Networking of almost any kind is going to work, and we'll talk about networking in a second, because I know that there are difficulties with that. But I half-jokingly say to people that they're probably going to have better results chatting to somebody who's standing next to them in the checkout queue in Sainsbury's than they will do by spending all day on job boards. 3 and 4 and 5, tell people about your goals. Tell people what you're trying to do. Friends and family and colleagues. It doesn't have to be a long pitch. It doesn't have to be cheesy. It doesn't have to be a sales pitch. Just tell people the kind of jobs that you're interested in, the kind of people that you're trying to reach out to. And having done that, learn how to conduct information interviews. I've got some tips on those for you later on in this webinar. But in principle, information interviews are organized curiosity. It's your way of getting in front of people, discovering some really useful information, asking smart questions, being remembered and being identifiable as a suitable candidate, and learning what a job is like from the inside. And finally, of course, back to those people in your little black book, using them at the right time when you can ask them a really focused question and get the best out of them. Now, while we're talking about shortening a job search, here's another tip that comes to me from an executive recruiter friend of mine. He said that so many people don't understand that their career story has to make sense, what they what they do is they apologize for having a career which is a connection of different episodes. So they say things like, well, I've worked in a number of different industries. It's been a bit random. I've moved around a lot. Now, don't say that. Make your work history a story. You have one career, so have one career story. And look at the connections, look at the points where you've moved from one job to another, and they need to be credible. And there's an easy way of doing that, which is to use a phrase like, I guess I was lucky. I think I was lucky because. Even if you were made redundant, even if a job didn't work out, talk about what you learned from the experience and talk about why you chose a new organization or a new role. Talk about what you learned in each role and try to make the whole thing sound as if it's a single story, and any role that is on offer needs to sound like the next credible, sensible, obvious chapter in your story. So think about that. Okay, let's cut to the chase. Let's think about what it is that you're going to talk about that's going to make you stand out, because that's the best way of shortening any job search. That's the best way of not sleepwalking your way into a dull, boring, predictable next job, kind of job that you could get in your sleep. What will make you stand out? What will make you be an exceptional candidate? Now, earlier on in our poll, you mentioned the biggest score, in fact, was for that item that said the biggest barrier is explaining my skill set. I think we don't understand transferable skills terribly well, or we're very passive about it. So you'll hear people say, well, I've got transferable skills, but people don't seem to get them. They don't seem to understand them. Now, the first rule about transferable skills is to avoid jargon. So because jargon is the language of another place, of another location, of another organization, which has no relevance because it doesn't mean anything. You use the language from the context of the job that you want to get into, and that's actually much easier than you think. You can learn that language from two sources. You can interrogate job advertisements, job descriptions. You can look at organizational websites, and even better, talk to people who work in those organizations. You know, a great question is, what kind of people are doing well in your organization at the moment? Listen to what comes back, write it down, because the words used to describe skill sets and attitude and personality and fit, those words are the words that our organization holds dear to its heart as a way of describing their top performers. Now, who makes skills transferable? Well, the answer is you. Skills only become transferable when an employer not only understands those skills, but gets excited about them. There's two things there. So first of all is translation. So to be able to say, this is what I have done, and using language which makes sense to the new organization, but you've also got to use language which is exciting. Because otherwise, what goes wrong is the skills don't make sense. We talked about jargon, we talked about dull stories earlier in the presentation today. We talked about the wrong language. And finally, the other thing that goes wrong here is that your personal contribution needs to be clear. So it's great to say we did this, and as a team we worked well. That's fine, but talk about your contribution to the team. Talk about what only happened because you were there. So think about making those skills transferable by really drilling down into the language that an organization understands and thinking about the language, the terminology which an organization is going to be really switched on when it hears. Here's a couple of other tips about skills. When people are talking about their skills, they tend to use fairly bland statements, like they say, well, I'm really good at this, or I'm an expert, or I'm an intermediate user. All that language really doesn't mean very much. These are three things that really help to communicate skills. First of all, describing the skill. Now, we've talked about describing skills in the language of your target organization. Work harder at that. Think about what terminology makes the difference between an average and an above average performer in the sector that you're trying to get into. And be clear about the fact that it is a skill. Be clear about the skills you want to talk about. Don't get mixed up with personality attributes. So to say that you're flexible or punctual or reliable, those are all aspects of personality. Skills are largely things that we do, and often they are things that somebody can record by observing us. So that's naming the skills. Second one is framing them. It's like a picture frame here, and that means you put them into a context. And the danger is that you over describe. You spend too long describing the jobs that you've done. Many candidates say far too much in a job interview. So framing is about context, and the simple way of talking about context is to describe the problem that was facing you, talk about what you personally did to overcome the problem, and then talk about the result. And if you really want to be sophisticated, and that's a very simple model that I've just described that you'll find in lots of different formats. There's a STAR model, which is situation and task and action and result. But the sophisticated bit is reflection. So when you think about what you did and what happened and what the outcome was, ask yourself the question, what did I learn from that? What would I do differently in the future? Because above average candidates do that little bit as well. So that's naming and framing. And finally, I want to talk about measuring. Because as I said, we describe our skills in fairly vague terms. You might say, I'm a good communicator. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean on paper, in person? Does it mean you can talk to one person or two people or 200? Measuring is related to context. So you might say, I had to communicate difficult messages to audiences of 200 people who had a whole range of very difficult questions. You might talk about measuring in terms of the range of that skill. So talk about the most difficult thing that you've done. If you're an Excel user, for example, talk about the most difficult, most challenging tasks that you've achieved using that skill. And you can also talk about the way that you've passed skills on to other people. That's another good way of indicating confidence and competence. So do come back to us at the end of this, or type in your questions as we go through if you've got any questions about how we communicate skills and how we get them across. Now here's some tips, some homework for you if you like, in terms of starting to build up an evidence bank, because that's what I like to do with candidates that I work with. I like them to go away and to think hard and remember and look at their work history and look at their past performance and come up with a lot of evidence of all the times where they made a difference, made a contribution. These are questions that you can ask yourself. How was your success measured? So you think you were successful. How do you measure that? Was it through output? Was it through hitting targets? Was it through specific feedback, maybe from colleagues or your boss or from customers? Was it about quality? Was it about going above and beyond the requirements of the task? And then think about what you're going to do with this evidence, because if you follow these the simple task and start to build an evidence bank, you're probably going to get to 2 or 3 pages of material. And then you're going to decide which bits of that material you're going to showcase, because that's what a CV does. It showcases the best parts of your experience, the most relevant parts, and gets an employer's attention. So showing rather than telling is about starting to use stories to communicate skills. So look at these pieces of evidence and try and compress them into really short stories. I do mean short, I mean 30 seconds. Talking about, well, this is a time when I faced this challenge, and this is what I did, and this is what happened as a result. 30 seconds, maybe 60, 90, yeah, anything much longer than that, you're going to start to bore people and you're not going to have a chance to get all of your relevant evidence across. Wherever possible, think about and talk about what psychologists describe as your motivated skills. Now, motivated skills are the skills that you perform to a high standard, but you also perform with enjoyment. So there's a degree of commitment and energy. Sit down and talk to somebody in the week ahead. Talk about a time when work didn't feel like work. Think about a real example, a real day, a real project. Ideally getting down to an experience that lasted no more than about 30 minutes. Those are the questions for you. What were you doing? What was the outcome? What did it feel like? Just like there's two characters on the screen there. What we're looking for is the energy in the story. Energy is a really important factor here. It's the difference between a so-so candidate and a candidate organizations want to invite back. Because movement requires energy. It helps people remember you. It helps people to commit to you as a candidate. And we know from our experience, from all kinds of research, that stories outperform information. We remember stories far longer than we remember simple information. And we remember energized stories even longer. I describe this process as bottling energy. There's lots of times in your working life, and maybe outside your working life too, where you have been energized, you have been motivated, felt really focused, you've been in tasks and the time has gone by quickly and you felt fulfilled and it felt useful and meaningful. Well, you've got to reconnect with that past. You've got to reconnect with the energy that came in those original experiences and bottle it and represent it. You represent it in your CV, in your LinkedIn profile. You represent it at job interviews very, very clearly when you use these mini stories to communicate your skills. And you use it every time you talk about yourself, because being remembered isn't just about facts. It's being remembered as an interesting and energized candidate. So, some of the basics I really want to get to grips with today. How do people find jobs? There's a lovely thing in the world of work called the rule of thirds. Because internationally, through a whole range of research projects, we know that about 1/3 of people get a job through word of mouth, and 1/3 of organizations in the UK and in most other countries fill jobs through word of mouth. Now, that's helpful in one way, but it's also entirely unhelpful. Why? Because as soon as you get to any role which is at a management level or specialized or supervisory, then the statistics change. Because the higher you go up the food chain, the bigger and bigger the proportion of jobs which are filled by word of mouth. Employers have learned in the last 10, 15 years, lots of ways of finding high quality staff at low cost. They do it through a mix of word of mouth recommendation and social media, and sometimes by setting up their own job boards, or sometimes by just having a cloud of candidates following the organization. We're talking about the hidden job market. And one of the things I reflect on in the latest edition of my book, How to Get a Job You Love, is the way that in 20 years of writing that book, this marketplace has changed significantly. A large number of people find jobs that are unadvertised. They don't go anywhere near a job board. And even if they do, even if they are advertised in some way, candidates have already been identified. People have already been informally shortlisted. These jobs are often not handled by human resources until quite a late stage. They are triggered, they are processed, they are dealt with largely by decision makers, line managers, division managers. And before they become job-shaped objects, they start as either a problem or opportunity, a headache, or something that an organization wants to get right. Now, the hidden job market is a key characteristic of the way job markets are now operating. They may seem unfair to you, they may seem difficult, they may seem puzzling, they may feel like the image on screen, they may feel like a maze. Because how do you know if things are working? And how do you know how long it's going to take? If it really is a maze, how do you know how many turns in the maze you need to take in order to start to get success, in order to start to get traction? Of course, the answer is you don't, because the random factor is immense. It could be the first turn of the maze that you meet somebody really interesting, somebody who's at the center of a network, or it could be much further on. But the important thing about following the maze is that you are starting to get results from the very first action that you take. So how do you know, ultimately, if you're having success in the hidden job market? It's not like sitting down and applying for 200 jobs where you can tick them off from 1 right through to 200. How do you know? Well, you know because your name comes up when you're not in the room. That is the key success criteria of the hidden job market. Your name comes up. And how do you know what will be said when your name comes up? Let me put it this way. 2 people meet tomorrow morning in a big office and your name comes up in conversation. What will be said about you? How many pieces of information will be communicated? Well, I have news for you. It's probably about 2 or 3. And the 2 or 3 pieces of information are probably items appearing on that list in front of you right now. Your expertise, what you really know about, the special focus, the thing that you are most attentive to, your working style, that's the personality bit, how easy you are to get on with and how you make things work. And also your connections. Connections could be other people you work with, it could be products or services or technology that you're connected with. Isn't that fascinating? That your CV contains maybe 100 pieces of information. In an interview, 30 to 40 will be probed. But when somebody recommends you next to a coffee machine, and your name comes up, it's 2 or 3 pieces of information. Every recommendation is around 2 or 3 pieces of information. Now, how do you know what those 2 or 3 pieces of information are going to be? Well, the really good news, ladies and gentlemen, is that you plant them there. That's how you know. It's information which you communicate every time you talk to somebody. So you're getting the idea that the key activity which makes things work for you in the hidden job market is about talking to people. It's about making sure that your name comes up, and when your name comes up, that key messages, key positive messages are also communicated. So clearly we're talking about networking. Now I'd like to think about how you feel about it, because people have an image in mind. So we're going to do a quick poll at this point to find out how you feel about networking your way into a new job. So the poll is now open, and I love a quick response from you now. This is a range of choices here. That you feel comfortable, confident, or number 2, it makes you feel uncomfortable, but you do it when you need to. 3, you wish you were better at it. 4, it makes you feel grubby. And 5, it feels like exploiting people. So there's your 5 choices. And we're running towards the end of the webinar now. We've got a few more slides to go through, and then we're good to allow some time at the end for your questions. Have a think now about what you'd like to ask about. And I wonder, Paul, if we've got some results on this latest poll.
Yeah, so the latest poll, we have 61% have said, I wish I was better about it. We've had 14% say it makes me feel uncomfortable, but I do it when I need to. 11% have said comfortable, confident. 8% say it makes me feel grubby, and 6% says it feels like exploiting people.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. So it's good to see that most of you seem to recognize that you need to do it, but you want to get better at it. That's great, because networking is something that we never get perfect at. We need to practice that. A significant number of people not so comfortable. And that's important, because when we talk about networking, when somebody like me says, well, how about some networking? What do you see yourself doing? Well, you might see yourself doing this. You might see yourself selling yourself confidently. And it's a bit worrying that that's how we start, with this idea that it's all about selling yourself, because of course that tends to work much better for confident extroverts. A lot of people, I think, feel that the activity is much more like this, more like being a slightly seedy second-hand car salesman. And some research in the United States by these three, Castigliano, Gino, and Kuchaki, said that a significant number of people feel grubby when they're networking. They feel a sense of inauthenticity and immorality as well. Now, the good news about that is that it is a feeling which goes away through practice, and also goes away when networking feels more like an honest exchange. Because the real concern that I have with networking is that it doesn't work exactly the way the textbook suggests. Because the advice that we often receive is you should get out there, you should be selling yourself. But the problem is that people actually don't like being sold to. It can often feel like that image on screen, that somebody's entirely in broadcast mode and you really don't want to hear it. So, think about when you're at a conference or event and somebody comes up to you and says, let me tell you my 5 top qualities, or my values, or this is my skill set. Actually, it's a difficult thing to hear, and particularly in a social setting. So, yeah, it can make us feel uncomfortable, but there are better ways of doing it. After all, most people, when they've come to an end of a career change period of their life, when they've been in transition and they find a new job, when I ask them anyway, I say, well, what would you do differently if you were looking for a job again in the future? They tend to say things like, well, I would do something different. I'd start talking to people earlier. So interesting that, isn't it? They don't say I would network like mad. They say I'd start talking to people earlier. And I'm a great believer in authentic impact. It's the subject of my book, The Success Code, which helps quieter people make an impact in the marketplace. It helps them find an authentic way of talking about themselves. There's a couple of ways into that. First one is to try to put a little pitch together, which is not about telling, but it's about asking great questions, making it a real conversation. But when that point comes, when somebody says, tell me a bit more about you, that you do have a short, focused message. So you don't pitch in with that straight away. You're going to spend most of a conversation saying, I'd love to know more about your role in your organization, and how did you get into it, and what do you enjoy about it? But there will always come a point, it's a social courtesy, when somebody says, well, what about you? Now, that's a really important point, because if you say, well, I'm not sure, or I'm a bit confused at the moment, or I've been looking for jobs, but I've had knockbacks, it's very, very easy to plant a negative message. Remember, I said earlier on that people are going to say 3 things about you when your name comes up. Well, if those 3 things are all about vagueness or negativity or bad experiences, then that's what people remember about you. And that's you don't want to be mentioned in the same sentence as words like, disappointment. Okay, so when somebody says, tell me about you, you're looking for a short and focused message. Now, this doesn't have to be high sales, it doesn't have to be cheesy, but could be a bit like this. 2 breaths. You take about 15,000 breaths in the course of a day. With 2 breaths, you can get some great information across. I want to be in a role which allows me to do A and B and C. Now, those A and B and C are your motivated skills. They're the things that you do really well and you enjoy doing. So they're easy to talk about in an organization that's doing X and Y and Z. And that describes the style, the size, and the scope of an organization. It's a bit like ready, steady, cook. You're dumping ingredients in front of somebody else and you will get interesting results with this kind of statement, because people will say, have you thought about? And they'll name an organization or a person or a way forward. And if you really don't like talking about yourself, even if this statement doesn't quite work for you, then try this. Don't talk about yourself. Talk about what you're interested in. So self-projection for the modest says, this is what I enjoy. This is what I'm fascinated by. This is what I've already discovered. And particularly if you're coming out of a business school at the moment and you've spent a lot of time looking at ideas and organizations and systems and concepts, talk about it. Talk about what the people and the organizations that you've spent time with, and make sure this bit of conversation has a hook on the end which says, let's take this further. I'd really like to find out more about. It's much easier to say, I'm really fascinated by this, than to say, I'm really good at. So remember that. So I did promise you early on to say, I'll say something about information interviews, and here goes. So an information interview essentially is your chance to be a kind of investigative journalist, except you're not writing it up. You're just learning for yourself, and you're improving your knowledge and you're improving your visibility. It's a short research interview. I sometimes say, half with my tongue in cheek, ask for an 11 minutes of somebody's time, because in 11 minutes you can get through this stuff. You're really asking great questions, organized discovery. So you're getting time with people, ideally face to face. You're not selling yourself. You're saying, I'm here to discover more about this organization. Ask about people's own career story. Ask what's changing in a sector, what the future looks like, what kind of people are doing well. Think of it as research, not job search. There will come a point when somebody says, tell me about you, and you should be ready for that. And when you've done a few of these, you are going to get closer and closer to actual decision makers. What are the benefits of information interviews? Well, the benefits are multiple. First of all, decoding. This is a great opportunity to really understand what an organization is looking for, understand what the words mean when job descriptions are put together. The second benefit is your confidence. You just benefit from the practice about talking to other people and talking about yourself. The third thing is matching, because it helps you choose. Once you actually get under the skin of real jobs, understand what it's really like to do a job, then it actually makes it easier to decide what's at the center of your target. Last two, mapping. Mapping, because there are thousands of different jobs out there. There are tens of thousands of new jobs coming along all the time. And when I say new jobs, jobs which didn't exist 12 months before. So we need to put something into empty map books. We have blank pieces of paper. Finding out what's happening in any sector can't be done simply through online research. You've got to talk to people. You've got to let them draw maps for you. And the last thing, and probably the most important, is that it improves your visibility. People remember you. So, and to summarize, information interviews, the rules of the game. Well, just ask great questions and listen and probe and ask smart questions and have that short statement ready to talk about yourself. And don't leave the room without connections. You can even start by saying, I'm here today because I'd like to talk to about a dozen people in your sector. So later on, when you say, have you any question, later on when you say, who else can I be talking to? Is there anybody you can recommend I have a conversation with? A name will come up, and you can ask simply then for a warm introduction. So you bounced onto somebody else. So that's how to find out a little bit more about my work, and it's my Twitter handle there as well. I'd be really happy to answer any questions that you have at this stage. And Paul, I wonder what kind of questions we might be dealing with today.
Yes, so we've had a few questions come in, so I'd definitely say to all the listeners on board to keep writing your questions in. We'll try and answer as many as you can. If there's any further questions which we can't do in the time limit, because we are almost to the end, I'll send them over to John and we'll get him to try and do all the answers afterwards. So I have one question, which is, when describing skills with name, frame and measure, is that how we should be approaching our CVs or only during the interview?
It's a condensed version of that. It's a great question. A condensed version of that goes into a CV as well, because and that's what a CV does. It's in bullet points. It quickly communicates what you do well, and using the language of a target organization is vitally important. So the CV should always project forwards, not backwards. It's not a historic document. It should project forward into the target organization. So yeah, make the identify the skill, use the right language, say something very brief about the context, and say something concrete about the results and the actions and the outcomes.
Excellent. So just a quick question about how would you structure CVs to get noticed? Would that be more with job experience with being bullet points? Would you keep the paragraphs? Maybe the layout? If you could just maybe explain a little bit more in detail about that for the listeners, because personally I found that's always quite a tricky point. When you apply for jobs, you send it over to people. There's always, this could be better, that could be better. There's never really a finalized outcome where you think, I've actually hit it nail on the head. It's perfect, and that's going to open up a lot of opportunities.
There isn't a perfect CV, and one of the problems is that everybody's got an opinion about it. A CV starts to work when you foreground information which opens the door. So that's the key outcome. It's not going to get you a job, but it is going to get you a meeting. So think about what appears on in the first third of page 1. Think about your opening profile, maybe put some bullet points on the end of an opening profile to really get some key messages across. And the reason we use bullet points rather than extended paragraphs is they're just much easier to read. People read a CV very, very fast. They're immediately attracted to things like job titles, but they are also attracted to strong language. So you start each bullet point with a verb. So you might say led or organized or initiated, and you vary the length of bullet points as well, so make it easy to read. But the most important thing is foregrounding the things that matter. If you show your CV to somebody, don't say, what do you think of it? Because you'll get one of 1,001 different opinions. The best question is, what does my CV say to you? And listen to the message coming back. And if it's a message that makes sense, and the hearer and the person that's read it is giving you a coherent summary that sounds useful, then your CV is probably working. If somebody says, I don't really understand you, then you've got a problem.
That's all good. Just another question. How would you recommend approaching a move from public to private sector?
Well, this is a really good example about where transferable skills need to be made transferable. So think about and research the language of new organizations and translate what you've done into something which makes sense. And that's really the only thing that can be done. To think about evidence from your past, which again makes sense in any sector. So anything relating to budgets or targets or overcoming difficulties or managing with tight resources. These are all things that make sense to a wide range of organizations.
Are there any tips you can give us about applying to be non-executive directors?
That's harder to do in a kind of 30-second response because it is a different process. But more than anything else, these roles are filled through word of mouth. So first step is always to get to spend time with people who are in those roles, so you really understand what the market is looking for, and you understand how they are filled, and you understand the evidence that you need to put forward. And it's also where a career story really matters, because your career story is the primary evidence that makes you a credible candidate. So thinking about how you're going to communicate that is very, very important.
How open should you be about other opportunities you're exploring?
There's no particular need to be. Yeah, if you're an effective job hunter, you're keeping lots of plates in the air at the same time. Just because one organization is getting very interested in you, you should also be pursuing anything else that's live and active. Because until somebody actually puts a piece of paper in front of you and asks you to sign it, everything is a project. So the only time I say to people, just reveal that you've got other irons in the fire, is simply by gently saying, can we move this forward a little bit, because I'm talking to a few organizations. But you don't use them as leverage, you don't use them as a gun to put to somebody's head.
Okay. And one final question, how do you balance the skills you have done in your present job to the ones you have not done or yet done to experience to back it up?
Okay, so you can approach this a few ways. You can either learn to describe your skills in a way that makes sense. You can get experience quickly, and sometimes just talking to people in organizations and understanding what the requirements of the job are is a fairly smart way of doing that. Occasionally you need to go off and get a piece of experience, maybe a short project or a piece of consultancy work, just to acquire those skills. The last thing is always to demonstrate that you're a quick learner, to show that from your actual experience how you have picked things up very, very quickly in the past. So that's a good fallback tool.
Excellent. So yeah, I'd just like to thank yourself there, John, for absolute great webinar. Myself, I found it very brilliant, very good content in there. Definitely a lot of skills and tips which I'll be taking forward for the future. I'm sure all the listeners found it great as well. I'd just like to say something to the listeners that our next webinar is on the 29th of November at 12 p.m. That's with David Trafford. The subject's going to be, should strategies be implemented or operationalized, and what's the difference? All the details are on the MBA World website, where you can find all the details, you can register. And just again, I'd like to thank yourself, John, and I look forward to hearing and seeing everyone at the next webinar.